He built empires from numbers, but the night he saw his maid teaching his child those same numbers that spoke a language only geniuses understood, he realized someone in his mansion had been hiding a mind greater than his own. The heavy mahogany doors gave a low groan as they opened, spilling a ribbon of golden evening light across the marble floor. The mansion exhaled silence. Every polished surface, crystal vases, carved railings, gold-rimmed portraits, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the return of its master. Then came the sound, a steady, deliberate rhythm of Italian leather shoes against marble, echoing down the grand corridor like a metronome of power. Richard Grant had come home early. He loosened the cuff of his tailored navy suit and rubbed the faint crease from his wrist where his watch had rested all day. He had canceled a dinner with investors in Hong Kong, claimed fatigue, though the truth was more complicated. He was tired of pretending that victory tasted like anything other than exhaustion. 48 years old, billionaire, founder of Grant Industries, a man who could buy anything except peace of mind. He paused beneath the great chandelier in the foyer, letting its light spill over him, fractured into gold by the crystal prisms. Silence. Perfect, calculated silence. He wanted a drink, a shower, and solitude. Nothing more. As he made his way down the hallway, the familiar emptiness wrapped around him like an old friend. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive loneliness. In this house of 10 bedrooms and 20 staff members, his voice was rarely needed. He preferred efficiency over conversation, obedience over connection. His son, Daniel, spent his evenings in the nursery with gadgets and tutors. Richard told himself it was enough, that providing was parenting, that success justified absence. But tonight something felt different. There was a sound where there shouldn't be one, a murmur. Soft, rhythmic, almost melodic. He frowned, following it past the framed oil paintings and the towering French doors that opened onto the terrace. The voice was coming from the study, a place he had turned into a museum of unread books and unused brilliance. He stopped just outside the doorway. Through the narrow crack between the door and its frame, Richard saw movement. Not the usual flutter of maids dusting or the butler adjusting curtains. It was slower, deliberate, almost reverent. He pushed the door open just enough to see. And then he froze. His maid, Maria Alvarez, stood in front of the massive whiteboard he had installed years ago but never used. Her simple black and white uniform contrasted sharply with the swirls of complex symbols behind her, curves of calculus, Greek letters, integrals dancing across the glossy surface like constellations. In front of her, perched on the edge of a leather chair, was Daniel, his 7-year-old son, eyes wide, face aglow with wonder. "Do you see it now?" Maria asked, her accent lilting gently through the stillness. "The numbers repeat in a pattern, like music. The secret to every problem is rhythm." Daniel's brow furrowed. "So, math is like a song?" Maria smiled, a patient, luminous smile that didn't belong in this house of marble and money. "Exactly. Once you hear the rhythm, you'll never forget it." Richard's breath caught. The whiteboard wasn't filled with childish equations. These were advanced, university level at least. Differential calculus, complex functions, symbols even he hadn't touched since his Ivy League days. His pulse quickened. For a moment, he thought it must be a mistake. His maid couldn't possibly understand those formulas, much less explain them with such grace. But the evidence was undeniable, written right there in bright blue marker, AC. A scade of precision and insight that no housekeeper could have accidentally imitated. He leaned against the doorframe, the cold wood grounding him as disbelief tangled with curiosity. Daniel was nodding, scribbling notes furiously in a small notebook. "I think I get it," the boy said, his voice brimming with pride. "It's like everything is connected." "Very good, Daniel," Maria replied softly. "Mathematics is the language of the universe. Once you learn to listen, even the stars will make sense." The word struck Richard with unexpected force. He had spent decades chasing order in the chaos of the business world, treating numbers as weapons, not poetry. Yet here, in the quiet corner of his own mansion, his maid was teaching his son to see beauty where he saw only strategy. A strange emotion stirred in his chest. Part awe, part shame, part something unnamed. His heart, accustomed to balance sheets and negotiations, stumbled over the equations on that board. He wanted to step forward, to demand an explanation, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the sight of Daniel's face, alive, radiant, more animated than he had seen in years. Perhaps it was the calm confidence in Maria's voice, the way she carried knowledge not as arrogance but as gift. For a man who controlled everything, Richard Grant suddenly felt like an intruder in his own home. The chandelier above them flickered, scattering light across the study's mahogany shelves. Maria leaned closer to Daniel, guiding his small hand as he drew a curve on the whiteboard. Richard's throat tightened. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "What on earth," he murmured, half to himself, half to the glowing reflection of his own disbelief, "is going on in my house?" Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim glow of his study's lamp long after midnight, the half-empty glass of wine forgotten beside him. The equations still haunted the whiteboard in his mind, symbols looping endlessly, mocking his assumptions about who people were and what they were capable of. He replayed the scene again and again, Maria's steady voice, Daniel's hungry curiosity, the precision in her handwriting. It was as if a secret world had unfolded right under his roof, a world he had never thought to look for. Outside, rain whispered against the tall windows, blurring the reflection of his own face. For the first time in years, the man staring back at him didn't look in control. He looked unsettled. The next morning, Richard came downstairs earlier than usual. The mansion was alive with quiet efficiency, the faint clatter of breakfast trays, the soft murmur of servants exchanging instructions. Normally, he would stride past them without a word. But today, his eyes searched for her. Maria Alvarez. He found her in the dining hall, straightening the chairs before the family breakfast. Her hair was tied neatly in a low bun, her movements calm, disciplined. She didn't notice him at first. When she did, she startled slightly, her posture stiffening as she reached for the silverware. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice composed, but a flicker of nerves danced beneath the surface. "Maria," Richard said evenly, setting down his coffee cup. "I'd like a word. In my study." For a brief second, her eyes betrayed something. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. She nodded quietly and followed him down the corridor. When the door closed behind them, silence stretched like glass between them. Richard leaned against his desk, studying her. In the daylight, she looked different. Not just a maid, but a woman carrying the weight of stories untold. "I came home early last night," he began slowly. "And what I saw," his voice faltered, "you were teaching my son." Maria's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her apron. "Yes, sir. Advanced mathematics," he interrupted, sharper than he intended. "Equations that most people can't even read, let alone teach." He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "So tell me, Maria, who exactly are you?" She hesitated. For a heartbeat, she seemed to shrink beneath his scrutiny. But then something shifted. Her spine straightened, her voice steadied. "I was helping Daniel with his homework," she said softly. "He asked about a formula he saw in one of my old notebooks." "Your notebook?" Maria nodded. "I used to study engineering. Before." "Before what?" Richard pressed, his tone softening despite himself. Her eyes lowered. "Before life took a different turn." The way she said it, simple, unembellished, carried more weight than 1,000 explanations. Richard waited, but she didn't elaborate. The silence between them grew heavier, filled with everything unsaid. "Finally," she continued, "when I came here, I didn't mean to cross any lines. Daniel was curious, and I thought a small lesson would do no harm. I'm sorry if I overstepped." Her words were humble, but her composure carried quiet dignity, the kind that didn't beg for forgiveness, but offered truth instead. Richard studied her face. The sharp instinct that had built his empire told him one thing clearly. Maria Alvarez was not ordinary. He walked around his desk, lowering himself into the leather chair, his tone measured but probing. "Engineering. Which university?" She hesitated again. "The University of Cordoba. I was in my final year when my father passed away. We had debts. I left before completing my degree." Her voice cracked slightly at the edges, but she caught herself quickly, straightening her shoulders. Something in Richard stirred. Not pity, but respect. He recognized that kind of loss. The cruel trade between dreams and duty. For him, it had been ambition. For her, survival. "I see," he murmured. "And you just decided to teach my son calculus in your spare time?" Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Not calculus, sir. Curiosity. He asked me what infinity meant. I tried to show him." Richard blinked. "Infinity?" "Yes," she said softly, eyes distant. "Children understand infinity better than adults. They haven't learned to fear limits yet." The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap. For a moment, he forgot the gulf between them, billionaire and maid, master and employee, and saw her as she truly was, a woman who had lost everything but still carried the spark of who she might have been. He cleared his throat, forcing himself back to formality. "You've done more for my son in a few evenings than a dozen tutors managed in months," he admitted grudgingly. "He looks at you like—" He paused, searching for the word. "Like you're showing him something the rest of us can't." Maria lowered her gaze. "Children see what adults ignore, sir." Her calm unnerved him. She wasn't flattered, nor defensive, just honest, and that honesty unsettled him more than any accusation. A knock broke the tension. Daniel peeked through the doorway, eyes bright. "Dad, Miss Maria's going to show me how to draw a spiral using numbers. Can I?" Richard glanced at Maria. She didn't move, didn't speak, waiting for his answer. He hesitated, torn between control and curiosity. Then he nodded slowly. "Go ahead." Daniel grinned and darted away, leaving the door half open. Maria turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her. "Maria," he said quietly, "I want you to keep teaching him." She froze. "Sir." "I said, keep teaching him," he repeated, his tone firm but gentler now. "Whatever you were doing, it's working." For the first time, surprise flickered in her eyes, gratitude too, though faint and quickly hidden. "Thank you, sir," she said, bowing slightly before slipping out of the room. When she was gone, Richard exhaled slowly. The silence of the mansion felt different now, not empty, but charged. Later that day, he passed by the study again. Through the slightly open door, he saw them. Maria kneeling beside Daniel, their heads bent over the whiteboard. Laughter, light, life. Something inside him shifted, a crack in the armor he'd worn for years. He thought of all the mergers he'd fought for, all the nights he'd traded for power, and yet, what he'd found tonight was more valuable than anything his empire could buy. Still, deep beneath the newfound warmth, another feeling stirred, unease. Who exactly was Maria Alvarez? And what other secrets were hidden behind those calm, intelligent eyes? The chandelier's reflection shimmered once more against the glass door as Richard turned away, whispering under his breath, This is only the beginning." Richard Grant began to change, though at first he didn't notice it himself. Days blurred into weeks, and something quiet yet undeniable had begun to stir in him, a restlessness that wasn't about business or profit, but about meaning. Every evening, almost unconsciously, he found himself drifting toward the same place, the study, where the sound of laughter, chalk, and curiosity had replaced the sterile silence that once haunted those walls. He never entered at first. He stood in the hallway, just beyond the golden spill of lamplight, listening. Maria's voice carried softly, measured yet melodic, wrapping complex ideas in gentleness. She didn't lecture, she invited Daniel to think. "You see, numbers don't just exist on paper," she'd say. "They dance in nature, in the petals of a flower, in the shells of the sea, in the rhythm of your heartbeat." And Daniel, once a restless boy addicted to cartoons and gadgets, would sit cross-legged, wide-eyed, sketching spirals and formulas with a focus that startled his father. Richard found himself captivated, not just by what Maria taught, but how she taught. It wasn't about equations. It was about unlocking wonder. He envied her for that power, a power he, for all his billions, had never possessed. One evening, curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the room quietly, pretending to be casual, but Maria and Daniel both turned. "Dad!" Daniel exclaimed, beaming. "We're learning about Fibonacci numbers. Did you know sunflowers grow using them?" Richard smiled, awkwardly at first. "Sunflowers, huh? Can't say that came up in any of my board meetings." Maria chuckled softly, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Mathematics hides everywhere, Mr. Grant, even in the boardroom, though perhaps there it takes on sharper shapes." Her tone was light, but the observation cut deeper than she knew. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by numbers that measured gain, not growth. He stayed that night longer than he intended, watching, occasionally asking questions, even making mistakes, and laughing about them. Laughter in that house was new. It startled him at first. Then it began to heal something long neglected inside him. Over time, their lessons became a ritual. Richard would come home earlier, Daniel would rush to prepare the whiteboard, and Maria, always calm, always composed, would begin the evening's session. Sometimes it was geometry, sometimes history, sometimes even music. Richard realized that Daniel wasn't just learning formulas, he was learning life. Within a week, the rumors spread online, tiny sparks fanned into flames. Billionaire's maid becomes his son's teacher. Grant family scandal. Housekeeper takes over child's education. Blogs speculated, tabloids twisted the story. Some hinted at impropriety, others mocked him for being sentimental. It hit the markets next. Investors called his office, nervous. His assistant whispered that shareholders wanted clarity. Clarity about what? That kindness had become contagious in his home? The Richard Grant of a ye, but as light grew inside the house, darkness began to gather outside. It started with whispers. At a business dinner one evening, a board member leaned across the table with a smirk. "Heard your son's being homeschooled by the maid, Richard. Planning to save money on tutors?" A ripple of laughter followed. Richard forced a polite smile, but something cold coiled in his stomach. "Be careful," another added slyly. "The media loves a good eccentric billionaire story. One headline and they'll tear you apart." Richard didn't respond, but the unease followed him home. He sat in his car outside the mansion that night, watching the warm light from the study windows. Inside, he could see Maria and Daniel bent over the board, heads close, two figures wrapped in the glow of something genuine and pure. He realized he didn't care what they said, not anymore. But the world cared. Arago would have called an emergency meeting, issued statements, perhaps even fired Maria to preserve appearances. But the man standing in front of that whiteboard every evening now, the man listening to his son's laughter, was not the same. He ignored the calls. He ignored the gossip. But Maria didn't. One evening, as the lesson ended, she stayed behind after Daniel went upstairs. Her eyes were tired, too tired for someone her age. She held a small newspaper clipping in her trembling hands. "I saw this," she said quietly. "They're writing about you. About me. I never meant for any of this to happen." Richard took the paper from her. The headline screamed in bold, "Maid turned tutor, billionaire's strange new experiment." He felt the anger rise in his chest. "You did nothing wrong, Maria. Nothing." "But it's hurting your reputation, sir," she said, voice breaking. "Your company, your name." "My name," he echoed bitterly, pacing across the room. "You know what my name stands for in those circles. Greed, control, numbers. Do you think that's worth more than what you've given my son?" Maria was silent. He turned to her, eyes burning. "You've done something no one else ever has. You made him curious. You made me curious again. Don't you ever apologize for that." For a moment, she just looked at him, seeing not the billionaire, but the man behind the suit. Then she smiled faintly, though tears glimmered at the edge of her lashes. "Thank you, sir, but some storms don't care about truth." The line hung between them. Simple, prophetic. The storm came the next week. His board demanded a meeting. Cameras waited outside his gate. Reporters shouted questions that echoed down the long marble driveway. His PR team begged him to distance himself from the story, but Richard refused. Instead, he stood before the press himself. No statement, no teleprompter, just conviction. "Maria Alvarez," he said clearly, "is not my maid. She's my son's teacher, and she's one of the most brilliant minds I've ever met. If that threatens your idea of class or privilege, perhaps you're the ones who need an education." The video went viral. The world split in opinion. Some mocked him, others admired him, but the truth, their truth, had finally been spoken aloud. That night, after the chaos subsided, Richard walked to the study. Maria was there, staring at the whiteboard, her eye is reflecting both pride and fear. "They'll keep talking," she said softly. "Let them," he replied, stepping closer. "I used to think power came from silence. I was wrong. It comes from standing beside what's right." Daniel peeked in, sleepy-eyed. "Dad, are we learning tonight?" Richard smiled. "Always." Maria turned, meeting his gaze. For the first time, neither employer nor employee stood in that room. Only two people bound by a shared revelation, that brilliance can bloom anywhere, and sometimes, the lesson life teaches isn't written in numbers, but in courage. Outside, rain began again, not as sorrow, but renewal. And somewhere between thunder and stillness, Richard Grant realized he hadn't just found a teacher for his son, he'd found redemption for himself. Morning came with a different kind of silence, one packed tight with the weight of other people's opinions. It settled on the mansion like fog, curling under doors, pressing against windows, whispering judgment in every corner. Richard felt it the second he stepped into the hallway, the way conversations the staff were having died mid-sentence, the way eyes dropped when he looked up. Outside the gates, cameras waited like vultures. Inside, he found himself wishing for the simpler kind of silence, the kind he used to buy with money and distance. He poured coffee he didn't drink and stared at the dark surface as if it could give answers. His phone pulsed with alerts. Headlines multiplied. Investors wanted calls. There were requests for statements, clarifications, denials. His legal team sent cautious emails that read like apologies in advance. He closed the phone and went looking for the only truth he could trust. He found it in the study again, where the lamp pooled a warm circle over the whiteboard. Daniel, still in pajamas, was drawing spirals, his tongue between his teeth in concentration. Maria stood beside him, pointing, not directing, not commanding, just guiding like a lighthouse. See. The sight landed in Richard's chest with a force that steadied him. Then the doorbell cut through the moment like a blade. The butler appeared, posture tight. The school principal is here, sir. She insists. Richard felt the old Richard flare, the version who handled interruptions with a scalpel. Show her to the east parlor, he said, and have security keep the press past the gate. The principal waited beneath a portrait of his grandfather, smoothing her skirt, eyes professional and cool. She offered the kind of smile that could sell concern as policy. Mr. Grant, thank you for seeing me on short notice. Make it quick, he replied. There are concerns, she began, choosing her words with delicate care. With the current media attention and the unconventional tutoring arrangement, some parents have questioned whether the school remains the best environment for Daniel. Children talk, they repeat what they hear. We want to protect him. Richard watched her carefully. Protect him from what? Curiosity, excellence, kindness. He leaned forward. Do you know what I saw last year when we hired the most expensive tutor in the city? A boy who learned to mimic answers without understanding. A boy who stopped asking why. Maria gave that back to him. Her practice calm thinned. Mr. Grant, I'm sure Ms. Alvarez is a lovely person, but credentials matter, optics matter. For an heir to your stature, the narrative matters. We'd strongly suggest a qualified tutor. We can provide names, or perhaps a temporary leave from classes until this passes. He heard the subtext, a polite eviction wrapped in concern. He nodded once, as if concluding a mental ledger. Thank you for your advice. Daniel will be in class tomorrow, and you can tell the board that our narrative is simple. My son is being taught by the best teacher he's ever had. He stood. The meeting was over. The principal rose, lips tightening like a purse string. As you wish, Mr. Grant. She left behind the faint perfume of politeness and fear. In the corridor, the security chief, Amir, fell into step with Richard. Sir, quick heads up. There's chatter online tying Ms. Alvarez to you personally. Nothing credible, but it's getting ugly, classist, xenophobic. Also, a particular board member has been stoking it. Name, Richard said. Victor Hale, Amir replied. He scheduled a special session at noon. Of course it was Victor. Silver hair, colder smile. The man collected favors like vintage cars and wore survival like cufflinks. Richard nodded once. Pull everything you can on Maria's academic record. I want facts, not gossip. Already on it, Amir said. In the study, Daniel looked up when Richard returned. Are we in trouble? He asked softly. Not with me, Richard answered. He placed a hand on the boy's head, then turned to Maria. Can you stay after 2? A lesson? She hesitated. Yes, sir. Daniel went back to spirals, counting in a whisper as if counting could hold the world together. By late morning, Amir returned with a folder. He didn't hand it over immediately. Before you read this, you should know, there's more to her story than a transcript. Richard took the file. Inside were photocopies and scans. University of Cordoba. Top marks, a scholarship award, a research assistantship under Professor R. Ceballos, a published paper co-authored on modeling load distribution in modular bridge design. Then a sudden gap, unpaid fees, withdrawal, a signature shaky with grief on a letter requesting leave after her father's death. It felt like holding a biography compressed into a bruise. Sir, Amir added carefully, I also spoke with the professor. He remembered her, said she had a mind like a blueprint, saw structure where others saw mess. He got quiet when I told him where she was working now. Richard closed the folder, jaw tight. Something hot and clean burned through the doubt. It felt like rage, but the kind that knew exactly where to land. Noon came with glass and chrome and the chill of boardroom air. The city lay like a grid of profit outside the window. Inside, the long table shone with the polish of power. Victor Hale was already seated, fingertips steepled, expression curated. Richard, Victor said, the tone almost affectionate. We're worried. He gestured to the screen where stock tickers crawled like ants. Volatility isn't your style. Headlines help no one. A simple fix. Issue a statement, hire a credentialed tutor, and return to business. Numbers will stabilize, another director added. We just need Normalcy. Richard let the silence stretch. He'd learned long ago that silence could be a weapon when used correctly. Then he spoke, voice even. Normalcy gave me a son who had stopped asking questions. Since when did we decide curiosity was a liability? Victor's smile sharpened. Since the market decided class confusion is. You can fund programs for the poor, Richard. Do it under a charitable arm, applaudable optics. But don't elevate the help into the air sphere. You blur lines. Investors don't like blurred lines. It makes them wonder what else you're willing to blur. It was naked now, the sneer under the silk. Richard leaned back, hands folded. When I was 26, I moved pallets at a freight yard while teaching myself options at night. A venture capitalist told me I didn't look like the next big thing. I learned then that some people collapse others to their job title. I also learned they're usually the ones who confuse safety with stagnation. Victor's eyes cooled. This isn't a TED Talk, it's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Exactly, Richard said softly, which means we either lead culture or become hostage to it. Here's my proposal. I stand by the teacher who reignited my son's mind. We announce an education initiative focused on undiscovered brilliance. We put money where our mouth is, labs, scholarships, hiring funnels. Or we can spend twice that fending off a PR fire that dies the second we act like we believe in merit outside a pedigree. A ripple moved around the table, surprise, calculation, the scent of possibility. Victor tapped a pen, considering which way power would flow. And the maid? He asked finally, letting the word fall like a coin into a well. She's Maria Alvarez, Richard replied, tone iron. Engineer in waiting, my son's teacher. If anyone from this board disparages her publicly or privately, they'll find themselves litigating the definition of defamation. Silence then. Not the old, hollow kind. The kind that concedes. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. They would back the initiative. They would back him. When Richard returned home, the press had doubled. Microphones thrust forward as if truth could be pierced. He ignored them and walked straight to the study. Daniel had constructed a city of paper towers and rulers, each labeled with numbers, each line straight but alive. Maria stood behind him, not touching the city, only watching it find its own balance. How did it go? She asked quietly, eyes searching his face. I didn't fire you, he said, and almost smiled at the absurdity of needing to say it aloud. I defended you. The board approved an education initiative, labs, scholarships, mentorship. Your name won't be in the shadows anymore. She looked as if he'd opened a door she had long stopped knocking on. Joy flickered, then faltered. He saw the tremor in her hand. Something in him braced. Maria? He asked softly. She tried to answer, but the words tangled. She forced them into line. There's something you should know. The world narrowed to the space between them. Today I received a letter, she said. Her voice was steady the way bridges are steady, tension hidden in every cable. From home, my mother, she's very ill. The doctors say I should come quickly. She swallowed. I'm so sorry, I never wanted to bring this to your door. For a heartbeat, the study light dimmed around the edges. Richard saw two parallel futures, each demanding something he could not outsource, the one where he asked her to stay and the one where he helped her go. Neither preserved the new world exactly as it was. Both required faith. Daniel's pencil rolled off the desk and clattered to the floor. He didn't move to pick it up. Miss Maria, he whispered, not looking at either adult, as if saying it to the air might make it less true. Are you leaving? Her breath hitched. She crouched to his level, hands gentle on his shoulders, voice a hush that steadied like a palm on a drum. I will never stop being your teacher, she said. Sometimes lessons travel, sometimes teachers do too, but I promise you this, learning doesn't leave. Tears glazed the boy's lashes. He nodded with the bravery children invent so adults don't drown. Richard felt something crack across an old scar he'd called success. He didn't reach for a solution wrapped in money. He didn't bargain with time. He only said the one thing that was true. We'll get you there, he told Maria. Whatever you need, we'll do it right. Her eyes filled, not with relief exactly, but with the complicated gratitude of someone who has learned that kindness can carry its own weight. I don't want charity, she said, the reflex born of survival. This isn't charity, he replied. It's a return on what you've invested here. She held his gaze a beat longer, then nodded, as if accepting that some equations solved differently than expected. Night pressed its face to the windows. The rain came again, softer this time, washing the glass in silver threads. Richard stood in the doorway and watched Maria show Daniel how to sketch a curve that begins here and goes on forever, approaching a line it never quite touches. He understood suddenly that this was what they were, 3 points on, a graph, each changing the other, bound by a trajectory they couldn't fully see. Asymptotes of love and duty, nearing, never ending. Down the hall a phone began to ring, a call from the jet coordinator or the doctor or the world impatient for logistics. He let it ring once, twice, then turned back to the board where infinity had been explained to a child like a promise. This, he thought, is the test. He was no longer afraid of the cameras or the board or the headlines. He was afraid of failing this room. The chandelier's reflection trembled across the glass in a constellation of gold, and for the second time since this began, he heard himself whisper. Only this time, there was no disbelief, only resolve shaping into vow. "Let them talk," he said into the hum of rain and breath. "We move." Richard hadn't slept more than an hour on the flight. The jet's cabin hummed with low, expensive quiet, but his mind refused to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maria's face framed by the yellow lamplight of the study. Brave, composed, already halfway gone. The pilot's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Grant, we'll be descending soon. Temperature on the ground is 33 Celsius. He looked out the window. Below, the world was green and raw. Hills folded into mist. Tin roofs glittered like coins scattered by a careless god. Somewhere down there was a woman who had changed his entire definition of worth. When the wheels touched the cracked runway, the heat hit him like a confession. The air smelled of dust, mango trees, and distant wood smoke. A convoy waited, one SUV, one ambulance, one cluster of faces watching as the billionaire stepped into their world. Maria met him outside the small hospital, her posture straight but her eyes rimmed red. "You came," she said, as if still not believing it. "You said your mother was ill," Richard answered. "I don't delegate gratitude." Inside, the building was a skeleton of care. Peeling paint, humming fans, the metallic scent of disinfectant stretched too thin. Maria's mother lay asleep, frail, breathing shallowly. Richard didn't speak. He only nodded to the doctor he'd brought, who immediately unpacked equipment that looked alien against the old wooden bed. While they worked, Maria stood by the door, twisting the hem of her dress. "She used to teach half the village to read," she whispered. "When she fell sick, I sold everything that wasn't memory." Richard looked around. He saw children peering through windows, wide-eyed and barefoot, watching science arrive like a miracle. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "Because pride feeds no one," she said. "But it keeps you alive long enough to try again." He understood. For the first time, he truly understood what resilience looked like. Not numbers on a balance sheet, but a woman who refused to let hardship erase her dignity. That evening, the village gathered outside Maria's house. Lanterns glowed like patient stars. The doctor gave cautious hope. The old woman would recover with treatment, and as the relief spread through the crowd, something unexpected happened. A little boy tugged Maria's sleeve, holding a battered notebook. "Miss Maria," he said, "will you teach us again, please?" She hesitated. Dozens of other children stepped forward, clutching torn pages and bits of chalk. Richard watched the scene unfold. She knelt down, smiled, and said, "Then let's begin." The makeshift lesson turned into a kind of magic. On the ground, Maria drew circles and numbers in the dust. The children repeated them like a hymn. The moon rose, silvering the fields. Richard stood at the edge of the light, his throat tight. The next morning he made a decision that would outlive any merger he'd ever signed. He called his office. "I want a team," he said. "Architects, engineers, educators, we're building here. Schools, labs, solar grids, name it, the Alvarez Foundation." There was silence on the line. His assistant finally stammered, "Sir, the board—" "Tell the board," Richard cut in. "This is the best investment they'll never understand." Weeks passed in a blur of movement. Concrete replaced dust. Classrooms rose from the earth like promises made visible. Maria moved among them, not as a maid, not as a guest, but as a leader, planning lessons, training local teachers, designing a curriculum that taught curiosity first and credentials later. Richard stayed long enough to see the first classroom open. The children cheered when Maria wrote the word infinity on a new whiteboard. "It means there's always more to learn," she told them. Back in the city, reporters were relentless. Billionaire builds schools in remote village. From maid to mentor, the woman who changed Grant Industries. For once, the headlines felt earned. Investors who had mocked him now called it genius philanthropy. He let them believe whatever version of the story helped them sleep. Months later, Maria returned to the mansion, Not in uniform, but in a simple blue dress. Daniel ran down the stairs and flung himself into her arms. "You came back," he shouted. "Dad said you might start a school here too." She laughed, tears bright in her eyes. "Only if you promise to help teach." Richard watched them from the landing. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with life. He walked down and offered Maria a folder. "The board approved the next phase," he said. "A partnership with universities, scholarships under your name. You'll run it if you're willing." Maria looked stunned. "Sir, I never wanted this much." "Then it's perfect," he said, "because the ones who don't crave power usually use it best." That night, the three of them sat together under the chandelier that had once witnessed only isolation. Daniel asked Maria to show them the equation she'd written in the village. She smiled, picked up a marker, and drew, "Love plus knowledge equal legacy." Richard added a line beneath it, steady and certain. "Legacy X, courage equals forever." The boy clapped. The adults shared a look heavy with memory and possibility. Outside, the storm that had once threatened to ruin them was gone, replaced by a sky so clear it looked infinite. And in that stillness, Richard finally understood the paradox Maria had lived by all along. When you give away what you know, you don't lose it, you multiply it. He stood, poured 3 glasses of sparkling cider, and raised his own like a toast to the impossible. "To infinity," he said. Maria smiled. "To beginning again." Daniel grinned. "To learning forever." And for the first time in the house's long, silent history, the chandelier trembled not from footsteps or storms, but from laughter. Bright, unmeasured, endless. The storm that had once hovered over the Grant mansion had long passed. Years had drifted by, leaving behind a home transformed, not by wealth, not by design, but by warmth. The same marble floors that once echoed with emptiness now carried laughter, footsteps, and the music of living. But peace, as Richard Grant knew all too well, is never a permanent guest. It visits, it lingers, and then, when tested, reveals what you've truly become. It was a quiet evening in spring. The chandeliers glowed like constellations above the dinner table. Daniel, now 12, was animatedly explaining a science project about wind energy. Maria sat beside him, listening with the same patience she had offered years ago, her eyes full of pride. Richard watched them, smiling faintly, thinking how once upon a time he had mistaken silence for peace. Then his phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. He almost ignored it, until he saw the sender's name, Victor Hale. The man had not spoken to him since that fateful boardroom confrontation years ago. Now his message was simple and chilling. "Turn on the news. Your foundation is under fire." Richard reached for the remote. The room fell silent as the screen flickered to life. Breaking news. Investigation into the Alvarez Foundation. Questions arise about funding, operations, and misused donations. Images filled the room. Reporters crowding outside school gates, whispers of financial mismanagement, fake documents bearing Maria's name. Maria's hand trembled on her glass. This can't be real." Richard stood, jaw tightening. "It's not. It's a setup." Daniel looked up, confused. "Dad? What's happening?" "Nothing that we can't fix," Richard said firmly, though his pulse told another story. Within hours, chaos erupted. Reporters camped outside the estate gates. Talk shows debated whether the foundation had been a vanity project, a billionaire's sentimental folly. Anonymous sources claimed Maria had funneled money to her home country. Her name, once a symbol of hope, now burned across headlines with accusation. Richard's legal team worked through the night, but by dawn, he knew this wasn't just about bad press. This was war. The next day, Maria sat in his office, her face pale, hands clasped tight. "They're saying the accounts are fake, that the funds didn't reach the schools." Richard exhaled slowly. "I've already ordered a full audit, but this isn't about numbers, Maria. It's about narrative." Her eyes met his. "You think Victor is behind this?" "I know he is," Richard said, voice low and cold. "He's been waiting for a way to discredit me ever since the board sided with us. He couldn't attack me directly, so he went after the one thing he knows I'll defend to my last breath." Maria looked away. "Then he's already won. You can't protect me from this, sir. The media—" "Stop calling me sir," Richard interrupted. "You think I care about media storms? About my name? I've survived worse. But I won't stand by while they drag yours through mud. You never walked in." His words carried fire. but beneath it was fear, the quiet, gnawing terror of losing something far rarer than fortune. Maria swallowed, her voice breaking. "Richard, if they find something, anything I might have missed, even an error." He reached across the desk and took her hand. "Then we'll face it together." For a long time, neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled again, faint but familiar, like the echo of their first storm years ago. By the end of the week, subpoenas arrived. Investigators combed through records. Cameras lined the gate. Maria stopped leaving the house altogether. Daniel, old anew, aged now to understand the cruelty of gossip, stopped answering his friends' calls. And Richard began to fight like the man he once was, but for the first time in his life, not for profit. He met journalists head-on, faced hostile interviews, opened every ledger to public scrutiny. He invited auditors, NGOs, education watchdogs. The truth was clean, he believed, and truth, if shown brightly enough, should be enough. But the world had grown addicted to outrage. A video surfaced, grainy, spliced together, seemingly showing Maria signing off on large wire transfers to unverified accounts. It was a forgery, but convincing. The internet exploded. Hate poured in torrents. Liar. Thief. Gold digger. Maria refused to eat. Daniel stopped speaking altogether. One night, Richard found her in the study, the same study where everything had begun. She sat by the whiteboard, the marker uncapped, but her hand motionless. "Maria," he said softly, "you shouldn't be alone right now." She looked up. "Do you remember what I said to Daniel? That math is about patterns. That everything, even chaos, has symmetry?" He nodded slowly. She turned back to the board and began writing, her voice steady even as tears glimmered in her eyes. "Every empire eventually tests the equation that built it. You taught me about leverage, Richard. But you forgot that when you build something that lifts others, it also becomes the easiest target for those who've never created anything themselves." He stood behind her, helpless. "We'll prove them wrong." "How?" she asked, turning to face him. "You can't argue with rumor. You can only outlive it." Then she smiled sadly, and for a terrifying moment, he saw resignation in that smile. The next morning, Maria was gone. Not vanished, just left. She'd taken a single suitcase, a letter, and disappeared before dawn. Her letter was short. "Richard, this battle is yours now. The world will believe what it wants to believe, but I won't let Daniel grow up seeing hate aimed at the people he loves. Protect him. Protect the foundation. I'll return when truth matters again. Maria." Richard read it 100 times, the ink blurring where his thumb pressed too hard. For weeks, he ran the foundation alone. He made public statements, funded investigations, tracked the forged documents to shell companies, and finally, to Victor Hale's private network. The revelation broke like thunder. Federal investigators raided Hale's offices. The fake accounts, the fabricated evidence, the media manipulation, all traced back to him. The story flipped overnight. Headlines changed tone. The same anchors who had condemned Maria now called her the woman who taught a billionaire to care. But Maria was nowhere to be found. Months passed. The foundation thrived again. Schools opened in new countries. Daniel, now 13, spoke at one of the ceremonies, confident, kind, sounding uncannily like both his teachers. Yet Richard felt the absence like a missing heartbeat. Then, one evening, as he walked through the study, his eyes fell on the whiteboard. The equation still lingered faintly from years before. Love plus knowledge equaled legacy, and beneath it, something new. Someone, Daniel he guessed, had written, "Legacy plus patience equals return." He almost laughed through the ache. She came back on the first rain of summer. He was on the terrace when the car stopped at the gate. She stepped out, older perhaps by months, but stronger by light years. The storm framed her like a memory coming home. Daniel saw her first and Dee sprinted across the marble floor. "Miss Maria," he shouted, and before she could reply, he was in her arms. Richard stood frozen at the door, every composed instinct dissolving. She looked at him, the same calm dignity in her eyes, but now with something new, peace. "They cleared your name," he said, voice low. "Victor's behind bars. The foundation's untouchable now." She nodded. "I know, I saw. You should have stayed. I could have protected you." Her gaze was gentle but unyielding. "Some storms you can't fight from behind walls, Richard. You have to let them wash you clean." He didn't argue. He simply stepped forward, closing the distance, and for a moment, one suspended heartbeat, neither billionaire nor maid existed, only two souls who had rebuilt each other from ruin. That night they gathered in the study again, 3 people, 1 board, endless lessons. Maria handed Daniel the marker. "Your turn," she said. He hesitated, thinking hard, then wrote in neat, confident letters, "Truth x time equals freedom." Maria smiled. Richard felt his chest tighten with pride. "That's the final equation," she said softly. "No," Richard replied, his voice a whisper over the rain tapping against the glass. "It's the beginning." He looked at them, his son, his teacher, his redemption, and realized that the empire he'd spent decades building was finally alive. Not in steel, not in numbers, but in hearts. Years later, when biographers asked Richard Grant about his greatest success, he didn't mention acquisitions or wealth. He simply pointed to the whiteboard, still hanging in the study, preserved behind glass. The final equation was there, in Daniel's handwriting: love plus courage plus time equals infinity. And below it, in Maria's neat script, one last line: for the child who believed, the woman who taught, and the man who finally listened. Outside the mansion, the rain had stopped, but the earth still shimmered, alive, renewed, infinite. And in that silence, Richard Grant finally understood. Some lessons are not meant to end. They are meant to echo, forever.